This happened about 3 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was driving home late one night after visiting my parents, who live a few hours away. The drive was long and uneventful, and the highway was nearly empty, except for the occasional semi-truck. I had my music on low, sipping a coffee I'd picked up at a rest stop, trying to stay awake. It was around midnight when I saw the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. My heart sank. I wasn't speeding, and I hadn't done anything wrong as far as I knew, but the lights were unmistakable. I pulled over to the shoulder, turned off the car, and waited. The police car stopped behind me, but something felt off immediately. The vehicle didn't look like a typical patrol car. It was an older model sedan, dark and unmarked, with a single light bar on the dashboard. I told myself, maybe it was just an undercover officer or a small-town cop car. Still, something about it didn't sit right. A man got out of the car and approached mine. He was wearing a dark uniform, but it didn't have any visible badges or insignias. He wasn't even wearing a hat. His face was partially shadowed by the faint glow of my taillights, and he had this unsettling grin that made my skin crawl. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth but unprofessional. "You know why I pulled you over?" "No, officer," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned down, peering into my window. "Your taillight's out," he said. I frowned. I'd checked my lights before leaving my parents' house. Everything had been working fine. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I just had my car serviced last week." His grin faltered for a split second before returning. "Yeah, I'm sure," he said, his tone a little sharper now. "Step out of the car and I'll show you." My gut screamed at me not to get out. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Can I see your badge?" I asked, trying to sound polite but firm. The man's smile vanished completely. "What? You don't trust me?" he said, his voice dripping with fake incredulity. He took a step back, and for a moment, I thought he was going to walk back to his car. Instead, he moved toward my passenger side door and tried to open it. Thankfully, I always lock my doors. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't a cop. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, putting it on speaker. As soon as the operator answered, I blurted out, "I think someone pretending to be a police officer just pulled me over. I'm on Highway 87, about 5 miles past exit 12. The man froze when he heard the operator's voice. His expression changed from cocky to angry, and he took a step back toward his car. "Forget it," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking quickly back to his vehicle. He didn't even bother to turn off the flashing lights before speeding off into the night. The operator stayed on the line with me as I described what had just happened. She told me to stay where I was until an actual patrol car arrived. About 10 minutes later, a real police officer pulled up behind me. His car was clearly marked, and his uniform looked legitimate. He asked me a few questions, and I explained everything as best as I could. The officer told me I'd done the right thing by not getting out of my car and calling 911. Apparently, there had been reports of someone impersonating a police officer in the area, pulling people over late at night and robbing them. In one case, the cop had even assaulted a driver who'd refused to cooperate. The police never caught the guy, as far as I know. For weeks after the incident, I kept replaying the scene in my head, thinking about what could have happened if I'd stepped out of the car. Now, whenever I see flashing lights behind me, I wait until I'm in a well-lit, populated area to pull over. And if I ever feel unsure, I call 911 to confirm it's a legitimate traffic stop. A few years ago, I rented out the basement apartment of my house to make some extra cash. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom unit with a kitchenette and its own private entrance. I'd had a couple of tenants before, and everything had gone smoothly. That was until I met Ryan. Ryan seemed normal enough when he came to look at the place. He was in his late 20s, clean-cut and polite. He told me he was starting a new job in the area and needed a quiet place to stay. He paid the deposit in cash, signed the lease, and moved in the following week. For the first couple of months, everything was fine. Ryan mostly kept to himself, and I rarely saw him. Occasionally, I'd hear his TV late at night or notice him coming and going, but that was about it. Then, things started getting weird. It started with small things. I'd hear footsteps outside my door in the middle of the night, but when I checked, no one was there. My mail would go missing from the mailbox, only to turn up days later in odd places. On the porch, under my doormat, or even inside my garage. Once I found one of my packages opened and resealed with duct tape. At first, I didn't suspect Ryan. I figured it was neighborhood kids messing around or just my own forgetfulness. But then I started noticing other things. The lock on my back door looked like it had been tampered with, and I began finding cigarette butts on the ground near my bedroom window. I don't smoke, and none of my friends do either. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of creaking floorboards. My bedroom is on the first floor, right above the basement unit, so I figured Ryan was moving around down there. But as I listened, I realized the sound was coming from the stairs leading up to my living room. I froze. I grabbed my phone and crept to the bedroom door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The creaking stopped, and for a few seconds, there was silence. Then, I heard the faint sound of breathing. Close, too close. Someone was standing right outside my bedroom door. My heart was pounding as I called out, "Who's there?" The breathing stopped. After a moment, I heard hurried footsteps retreating down the stairs and the sound of the basement door slamming shut. I locked my bedroom door, sat on my bed, and called the police. When they arrived, I explained what had happened. They went down to the basement to question Ryan, but he wasn't there. His car was gone, and his unit was locked. The officers told me to call them if anything else happened and left. The next morning, I went down to the basement to check on the apartment. Everything seemed normal at first, until I opened the closet in the bedroom. Inside was a small pile of items. My missing mail, a set of spare keys I thought I'd lost, and a notebook. The notebook was filled with detailed notes about my daily routine. What time I left for work, when I came home, who visited me, what I wore, even what I ate. There were pages and pages of this stuff, along with crude sketches of my house and little scribbles in the margins that said things like, "Watch tonight," and "Check her room." I felt sick. I called the police again and showed them what I'd found. They told me they'd look into it, but didn't seem particularly concerned. Ryan returned later that day, acting like nothing had happened. When I confronted him about the notebook, he claimed he'd found it somewhere in the house and was keeping it to return it to me. It was such a blatant lie that I didn't even know how to respond. I told him he had 30 days to move out, but he refused, saying he had a lease and I couldn't evict him without a court order. He was technically right, and I had no choice but to start the eviction process. It was a nightmare. Over the next few weeks, Ryan's behavior escalated. He'd leave his lights on all night, play loud music at odd hours, and even left the door to his unit wide open one night, exposing what looked like a collection of knives displayed on his kitchen counter. I didn't sleep much during that time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the court ruled in my favor. The sheriff showed up to escort Ryan off the property, and I watched from the safety of my living room as he packed up his things. Before he left, he looked up at my window and gave me this chilling smile. "I'll be back," he said, his voice calm and even. I never saw him again, but for months afterward, I felt like I was being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside the window sent me into a panic. I eventually moved out of that house and swore I'd never rent to anyone again. Some people seem normal on the surface, but you never really know what's lurking beneath. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what they do, it's what they might do. So I live in a small apartment building with 6 units. It's not the fanciest place, but it's affordable. And my neighbors usually keep to themselves. I'd been living there for about a year, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened until one random Thursday night. It was around 11 p.m., and I was getting ready for bed. My apartment's layout is pretty basic. A small living room, a kitchen that's part of the same space, a tiny bedroom and a bathroom. My front door opens directly into the living room, and there's a peephole so you can see who's outside. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard a knock at my door. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't exactly timid either. I paused, toothbrush in hand, and waited. Maybe they'd realize they had the wrong apartment and go away. But no, the knock came again, louder this time. At this point, I was more annoyed than anything. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was late. I grabbed my phone and walked to the door. Looking through the peephole, I saw one of my neighbors, Dave. I didn't know him well, but I'd seen him around. He was in his mid-40s, always wore a baseball cap, and seemed harmless enough. Still, something about him standing there that late at night made me uneasy. I opened the door just a crack. Enough to talk to him, but not enough for him to push his way in, you know? "Hey, what's up?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Hey," he said, not making eye contact. Sorry to bother you, but do you have a plunger I could borrow? My toilet's clogged." It was such a weird request, especially at that hour. I hesitated, but figured he was probably telling the truth. "Yeah, hold on," I said, closing the door to grab the plunger from under my sink. When I came back and opened the door, I handed it to him and he thanked me. But then he just stood there holding it, not moving. His eyes darted around, avoiding mine. "Anything else?" I asked, feeling the hairs on my neck start to stand up. He shook his head and mumbled something about bringing the plunger back soon before walking off. I closed and locked the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. About 15 minutes later, just as I was starting to relax, there was another knock at my door. This time it was more aggressive. My stomach dropped. I went to the peephole again, and sure enough, it was Dave. He wasn't holding the plunger anymore, and he looked different. His face was flushed, and he seemed agitated, almost jittery. "Who is it?" I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's me," he said. "I forgot to ask. Do you have any drain cleaner? The plunger didn't work." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. His tone was off, like he was trying too hard to sound casual, but couldn't hide the tension in his voice. "Sorry, I don't," I said firmly. "Try the store down the street." There was a long pause. I watched through the peephole as he just stood there staring at the door. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. At this point, I was freaked out. I decided to stay up for a bit and keep an eye on things. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and sat on the couch with my phone, scrolling mindlessly to calm my nerves. About an hour later, I heard footsteps outside my door. They stopped directly in front of my apartment. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, to my horror, I heard the sound of my doorknob being jiggled. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator what was happening. She told me to stay on the line and stay quiet. As I watched through the peephole, I saw Dave standing there, trying to open my door. He had something in his hand, a screwdriver or some kind of tool, and he was messing with the lock. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but it felt like an eternity. Dave was muttering to himself, something I couldn't make out, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. Finally, I saw the flashing red and blue lights outside. Dave must have seen them too, because he bolted down the hallway. The officers caught him before he made it out of the building. It turns out Dave had a history of breaking into apartments and stealing from tenants. The screwdriver was just a tool he used to pop locks. I don't know why he targeted me specifically, but the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't locked my door or called the police still keeps me up at night. I moved out a month later and have been hyper-vigilant about my safety ever since. Always trust your gut. It might just save your life. This happened last year while I was traveling for work. I had a conference in another state and had booked a room at a mid-range hotel for the 3-night trip. The place was nothing fancy but seemed clean and well kept, with decent reviews online. At first, everything was fine. The staff was friendly, and the room was comfortable enough for my needs. The first night passed without incident, but on the second night, something strange happened. I got back to the hotel late after dinner with colleagues, around 11 p.m. The hallways were quiet, the kind of silence you only find in hotels at night. I had a room at the very end of the hall on the 4th floor, which meant I had to pass several other rooms to get to mine. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed a man standing near one of the room doors. At first, I thought he was trying to get into his room. He was facing the door, fumbling with something in his hands, so I assumed it was his key card. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't holding a card. He was holding the door handle, just standing there, gripping it tightly. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. The man turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see part of his face. His expression was blank, almost emotionless, and he didn't say anything. Feeling uneasy, I gave a polite nod and kept walking toward my room. When I glanced back, he was still standing there, staring at the door handle like it held the answer to some unspoken question. I tried to brush it off as odd but harmless behavior. Maybe he was locked out of his room or had too much to drink. Still, I made sure to double lock my door when I got into my room, just in case. Later that night, around 2 a.m., I was woken up by a faint sound. It was rhythmic, almost like tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the room next door. But as I sat up and listened, I realized it was coming from outside my door. I froze. The tapping was soft but deliberate, like someone lightly knocking or dragging their fingers across the door. My heart started to race as I climbed out of bed and crept toward the door. I didn't want to make a sound, afraid of alerting whoever, or whatever, was out there. Peeking through the peephole, I held my breath. It was the man from the hallway. He was standing just outside my door, his face inches from the peephole, staring directly at it. His lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. It was like he was whispering to himself. The words meant only for him. My stomach churned as I realized he must have followed me to my room. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. Should I call the front desk? The police? Before I could decide, the tapping stopped. I checked the peephole again, but he was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went to the front desk and told them what had happened. The receptionist looked concerned and promised to check the security cameras. When I returned to the desk later that afternoon, the manager called me into a back office. They showed me footage from the previous night. It started with me walking down the hallway, passing the man near the door. After I entered my room, the man stood there for another few minutes, staring at the door he'd been holding. Then he turned and walked down the hallway, directly to my room. He stood outside my door for over an hour, pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to press his ear against it. At one point, he crouched down, trying to look under the door, and then stood back up and just stared at it. The manager told me they'd called the police and that the man wasn't a guest at the hotel. He'd been wandering the building for hours, somehow bypassing security, and had likely followed me in from the parking lot. When the police searched the area, they didn't find him. I checked out of the hotel immediately and booked a flight home for the next day. Even now, the thought of him standing outside my door, watching and waiting, makes my skin crawl. I've started carrying pepper spray and always check the peephole before opening any door. Hotels are supposed to feel like a safe, temporary home, but sometimes the walls that separate you from the outside world aren't nearly thick enough. A couple of years ago, I moved into an old apartment building in the heart of the city. It wasn't the nicest place, peeling paint, creaky floors, and plumbing that sounded like a symphony of clanks whenever you turned on the faucet. But it was affordable, and I was desperate for a place close to work. The building only had 4 units, 2 on the ground floor and 2 upstairs. My apartment was on the ground floor, and the unit above me had been vacant since I moved in. It was quiet, almost eerily so, and I appreciated the peace. That changed about a month after I moved in. Late one night, I heard footsteps coming from the apartment above me. They were slow and deliberate, the kind of steps you might hear someone take when they're pacing. At first, I thought maybe the landlord had rented the unit out, but when I asked him the next day, he said it was still empty. "It's probably just the building settling," he said dismissively. I wanted to believe him, but the footsteps didn't stop. Almost every night I'd hear them, pacing back and forth, stopping for a few moments, then starting again. Sometimes they'd last for hours, other times just a few minutes. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. One night I decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone, I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering light bulb casting long, ominous shadows on the walls. I stopped in front of the door to the vacant apartment and listened. The footsteps had stopped. I knocked on the door, feeling a little foolish. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. As I stood there debating whether to leave, I thought I heard something. A faint shuffle, like someone moving just beyond the door. I went back downstairs and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. A week later, things got weirder. I started finding dirt and debris on the staircase, as if someone had been tracking mud in and out of the building. Once, I even found a cigarette butt near the entrance, even though the landlord had a strict no-smoking policy. When I brought it up to him, he shrugged and said he'd look into it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor above me. It was loud and deliberate, like someone was moving furniture. I checked the time, 2:47 a.m. My stomach sank as I remembered the landlord's words. The apartment was supposed to be empty. The noise stopped after a few minutes, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning, I decided to press the landlord for answers. When I mentioned the noises, his face grew pale. "Are you sure you're hearing things from the second floor?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said. "Every night there's pacing, and last night, it sounded like someone was dragging something." He hesitated, then sighed. There was a tenant in that apartment about a year ago. He was strange, quiet, kept to himself, but other tenants started complaining about him. Said he was up all night, pacing, making odd noises. Eventually, he stopped paying rent, and I had to evict him. He didn't take it well.
"What do you mean?" I asked.
"He threatened me," the landlord said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Said he'd come back. But he's long gone now, and I changed the locks after he left." His explanation didn't ease my mind. That night I stayed up, determined to figure out what was going on. Around 1 a.m., the footsteps started again. This time I grabbed a broom and banged on the ceiling. "Hey, knock it off," I shouted. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought it worked. But then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the creak of the stairs leading down to my floor. Someone was coming. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and grabbed my phone, dialing 911. The operator asked for my address, and as I whispered it into the phone, I heard the footsteps stop just outside my door. There was a pause, then the faint sound of someone trying the doorknob. "Officers are on their way," the operator said, trying to keep me calm. I sat there, clutching my phone, barely breathing, until I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The footsteps retreated, and by the time the police arrived, whoever had been at my door was gone. The officers searched the building and found the upstairs apartment unlocked. Inside, they discovered signs that someone had been living there: an old mattress on the floor, empty food wrappers, and a small pile of clothes. They also found a set of keys that matched my apartment door. The police told me the person had likely been sneaking into the building through a broken window in the basement. They didn't catch him that night. But a few weeks later, I got a call from the landlord. The police had arrested a man matching the description of the former tenant, and he confessed to breaking into the apartment. I moved out as soon as I could. Even now, I can't hear footsteps above me without feeling a wave of panic. The thought that someone was living right above me, watching and waiting, still gives me chills. About 5 years ago, I was between jobs and desperate for work. I spent hours scrolling through Craigslist every day, hoping to find something that would hold me over until I could land something permanent. One afternoon, I came across a listing that seemed perfect. A man was looking for help moving furniture out of an old storage unit and into a truck. It was advertised as a one-day gig for $200 cash. The poster, who went by Rick, had left a phone number, so I texted him. He replied almost immediately, saying he needed someone the next day and asking if I was available. When I said yes, he gave me an address for the storage facility and told me to meet him there at 8 a.m. The place was about 30 minutes outside of town, in an industrial area I wasn't familiar with. When I pulled into the lot, I immediately felt uneasy. The facility looked run down with rusted gates and broken lights. There was only one other car parked near the entrance, a beat-up old truck that had definitely seen better days. A man was leaning against it, smoking a cigarette. "Rick?" I called as I got out of my car. The man nodded and walked over, extending his hand. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, with greasy hair and a wiry build. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Storage unit's just around the corner." Something about him felt off, but I brushed it off as nerves. He led me around the side of the building to a unit with the door partially open. The inside was packed with furniture. Old couches, wooden tables, boxes stacked to the ceiling. It looked like the contents of an entire house crammed into one space. "We've got a lot to do," Rick said, handing me a pair of gloves. "Let's get started." For the first hour, everything seemed fine. We worked in silence, moving heavy pieces of furniture out to the truck. I was sweating and exhausted, but the thought of $200 kept me going. Then, out of nowhere, Rick's demeanor changed. "Hey," he said, his voice sharper than before. I need you to grab something from the back of the unit." I turned to look where he was pointing. The back of the unit was dark, with only a faint beam of light from the open door illuminating the area. I hesitated. "What is it?" I asked. "There's a box back there," he said. "Big one? You'll see it." Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I walked to the back, squinting in the dim light, and spotted a large, unmarked box. As I bent down to pick it up, I heard the storage unit door slam shut behind me. "Rick?" I called, panic rising in my chest. No response. I tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on it, yelling for him to let me out. But all I could hear was the sound of my own voice echoing inside the unit. My heart was racing. What the hell was going on? Then I heard his voice, muffled but clear. "Stay put," he said. "I'll be back." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but there was no service. The metal walls of the storage unit must have been blocking the signal. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. That's when I noticed something strange about the box I'd been sent to retrieve. It wasn't sealed. I opened it, my hands shaking, and froze. Inside were chains, duct tape, and what looked like bloody rags. My stomach churned and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a stack of boxes. I needed to get out of there. Using all my strength, I started kicking at the door. It took several tries, but eventually I managed to bend it just enough to create a gap. I squeezed through, scraping my arms in the process, and bolted toward the parking lot. Rick was standing by his truck, talking on his phone. When he saw me, his eyes widened. "What are you doing?" he yelled. I didn't answer. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot, my hands shaking on the wheel. As I drove, I called the police and told them everything. A few days later, I got a call from the detective handling the case. They'd found Rick and searched the storage unit. According to the detective, Rick wasn't just some guy looking for help moving furniture. He'd been using Craigslist to lure people to remote locations. There were reports of other people who'd gone missing after responding to similar ads. They didn't tell me all the details, but the detective said I was lucky to have gotten away. If you're ever desperate for work, please be careful where you look. Not everyone out there has good intentions. And sometimes, the $200 isn't worth the risk. 2 years ago, I was on a solo road trip to visit some friends a few states over. I'd left after work, hoping to drive through the night and avoid heavy traffic. Around 1 a.m., I started to feel the fatigue hit me hard. I decided to stop at a small gas station off the highway to grab a coffee and stretch my legs. The gas station was the kind of place you'd only find in the middle of nowhere. It had a single pump, a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours," and one of those old-fashioned swinging doors leading into the shop. The parking lot was empty, except for a rusty pickup truck parked near the side of the building. When I stepped inside, the place was eerily quiet. Behind the counter was an older man wearing a trucker hat. He gave me a quick nod, but didn't say anything. I poured myself a cup of coffee from a pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks and wandered over to the snack aisle to grab something to keep me awake. That's when I noticed him. A man was standing at the end of the aisle, partially obscured by the shelves. He was tall, dressed in a hoodie with the hood pulled up, and he wasn't holding anything. He wasn't even looking at the shelves. He was staring at me. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. My first thought was that he was just another customer, but the way he stood there, completely still, his face partially shadowed, sent a chill down my spine. I gave him a quick nod and turned my attention back to the snacks. hoping he'd take the hint and move along. He didn't. Every time I glanced up, he was still there, watching me. The longer it went on, the more I could feel my pulse quicken. I grabbed a random bag of pretzels and walked to the counter, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The cashier rang me up without a word. As I was paying, I glanced over my shoulder and saw the man standing at the entrance, blocking the door. He wasn't staring anymore. He was just standing there, his back to me, as if he were guarding the exit. "Everything okay?" I asked the cashier, keeping my voice calm. The old man didn't look up. "You need a receipt?" he asked, completely ignoring my question. I shook my head, grabbed my stuff, and took a deep breath. When I turned back toward the door, the man was gone. Relieved, I hurried outside, telling myself I was just overthinking things. As I walked to my car, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, but the parking lot was empty, except for the rusty pickup truck. The sound of the footsteps stopped as soon as I turned. I didn't waste any more time. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I pulled out of the parking lot, but I felt a little better once I was back on the highway. The gas station disappeared into the darkness behind me, and I tried to convince myself it was just a weird encounter with a socially awkward guy. About 10 minutes later, my rearview mirror caught a glimpse of headlights in the distance. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was late, and there were only a few cars on the road. But as the minutes passed, the headlights grew closer until they were right behind me. It was the rusty pickup truck. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that it could be a coincidence. Maybe the guy was just heading in the same direction. But when I sped up, so did he. When I changed lanes, he followed. Every move I made, he mirrored. Panic set in. My heart was racing, and my hands were gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I knew I had to do something, so I took the next exit, hoping to lose him. The road was winding and dark, surrounded by dense trees. When I looked in the mirror, the truck was still there. At this point, I was practically hyperventilating. I spotted a small diner up ahead, its parking lot lit by a few streetlights. Without thinking, I swerved into the lot and parked right in front of the entrance. The truck slowed as it passed the diner but didn't pull in. Instead, it continued down the road, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. When I finally felt composed enough to drive, I told myself I'd stick to busier highways and avoid any more deserted gas stations. The next morning, I stopped at another gas station in a small town to fill up. As I went inside to pay, I overheard a conversation between the cashier and another customer. They were talking about a man who'd been arrested the night before for harassing drivers on the highway. When they described the truck, rusty, old, with a dent in the left side, I felt my stomach drop. To this day, I don't know what that man's intentions were. Maybe he was just trying to scare me. Or maybe it was something far worse. Either way, I've never stopped at a gas station late at night again. A few years ago, I moved to a small mountain town for work. It was peaceful, surrounded by forests and hiking trails, and a much-needed escape from city life. One of my favorite things to do was take evening walks on a trail that started near my house. It wasn't overly secluded, but it was quiet enough to clear my mind after a long day. This particular trail looped around a small lake and took about an hour to complete. On most days, I'd see a couple of joggers or people walking their dogs, but it wasn't uncommon to have the path to myself, especially on weekdays. That's why, when I set out one Thursday evening, I didn't think twice about being alone. It had rained earlier in the day and the ground was still damp, the air cool and crisp. I'd made it about halfway around the lake when I saw her. A woman was standing about 50 yards ahead of me, just off the trail, facing the trees. She wasn't moving, just standing there, motionless, as though she were listening to something. Her back was to me, and she was dressed in a long coat that looked too heavy for the mild weather. "Hello?" I called out, slowing my pace. She didn't respond. Something about her posture made me uneasy. Her head was slightly tilted, and her arms hung limply at her sides. It didn't look natural. I hesitated, debating whether to approach or turn back. Then, as if she'd sensed me, she slowly turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. But what struck me the most was her expression. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was almost blank, like she was in a trance. "Are you okay?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the woods, her arm trembling slightly. "There's someone out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean? Did you see someone?" She nodded slowly. "A man. He's been following me." I looked around, my heart pounding. The woods were dense, and the fading light made it difficult to see past the first few rows of trees. "Are you sure? Where did you see him?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started walking back toward the trailhead, her movements stiff and deliberate. I considered following her, but decided to continue my walk instead. If there really was someone out there, I wanted to get back to the main road as quickly as possible. As I picked up my pace, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me whip my head around. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the woman again. But the trail behind me was empty. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like heavy breathing, coming from the woods to my right. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The breathing stopped, replaced by the sound of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" No response. I started walking faster, my eyes darting between the trail and the woods. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the path. Every step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Then, up ahead, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from behind a tree and onto the trail. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. He was about 20 feet ahead of me, standing perfectly still, his face hidden by the shadows. I stopped in my tracks, my stomach twisting into knots. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me, or at least I assumed he was staring. I couldn't see his eyes. Slowly, I began to back away, keeping my eyes on him. My mind raced with possible scenarios. Could I outrun him? Should I call for help? My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't want to look away long enough to grab it. Then, without warning, he took a step toward me. I bolted. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. The trail seemed endless, every bend revealing more trees and shadows. I didn't dare look back. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, gaining on me. Finally, I saw the parking lot come into view. A wave of relief washed over me as I sprinted toward the safety of my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling, and managed to unlock the door just as I heard the footsteps stop. I turned to look back at the trail, but it was empty. The man was gone. I didn't waste any time. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove straight home. When I got there, I called the police and reported what had happened. They sent an officer to check the area but didn't find anything. The officer told me they'd had a few similar reports in recent weeks. People seeing strange figures on the trails, feeling like they were being followed. I haven't been back to that trail since. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't run still keeps me up at night. Sometimes I wonder if the woman I saw at the start of the trail had been warning me or luring me into something I barely escaped. About a year ago, I was on a cross-country road trip, trying to make the most of some time off between jobs. I didn't have a strict plan, just a list of places I wanted to see, and enough savings to keep me afloat for a few months. It was freeing, but also a little unnerving at times, especially when I found myself in the middle of nowhere. One night, after hours of driving through desolate highways, I pulled into a gas station to fill up. It was one of those old, run-down places with flickering lights and peeling paint. There was a single car parked near the side of the building, and the inside of the store was dimly lit. I went inside to pay, and the cashier greeted me with a slow nod. He was an older man with a scruffy beard and a stained flannel shirt. The whole place smelled like old coffee and motor oil. As I handed over my card, he asked, "You passing through or sticking around?" "Just passing through," I said, trying to be polite but not too conversational. "You sure about that?" he said, his tone shifting slightly. "We could use someone like you around here." I laughed nervously. "Thanks, but I'm just on a road trip." He shrugged and handed me my receipt. "Suit yourself, but if you change your mind, let me know. There's always work to be done." The interaction felt off, but I brushed it aside as small-town awkwardness. I filled up my tank and got back on the road. About 20 minutes later, I realized I was running low on snacks and drinks. I hadn't seen another gas station in miles, so I decided to double back to the one I'd just left. When I pulled into the lot, something immediately felt wrong. The lights were off and the store was completely dark. It was strange because the place had been open and lit just 20 minutes earlier. I parked my car and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the distant sound of crickets. "Hello?" I called out, peering into the windows. The inside looked exactly as it had before. Shelves stocked with snacks, the counter cluttered with random knickknacks. But there was no sign of the cashier. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. The same car that had been parked near the side of the building earlier was now behind my car, blocking me in. The driver's seat was empty, and the driver's door was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, but I didn't see anyone. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping whoever owned the car would hear me. "You're blocking me in." No response. I walked toward the car, keeping my distance, and peeked inside. The keys were still in the ignition, and there was a crumpled map on the passenger seat. The back seat was empty except for a dark stain on the upholstery that made my stomach turn. I backed away, my heart pounding. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind the gas station. I spun around and saw the cashier emerging from the shadows, holding a flashlight. His face was expressionless, his eyes fixed on me. "What are you doing back here?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "I forgot to grab some snacks earlier," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but it looks like you're closed." "We don't close," he said, his tone unsettlingly calm. "But you shouldn't have come back." My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my mind racing for an excuse to leave. "I'll just head out then," I said, forcing a smile. Sorry to bother you." The cashier stepped closer, his flashlight shining directly in my face. "Not so fast," he said. "You said you were looking for work, didn't you?" "I didn't," I stammered, inching toward my car. "I'm just passing through." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusty knife. "We've got plenty of work for you," he said, taking another step forward. I didn't wait to see what he meant. I bolted toward my car, yanking open the driver's side door and slamming it shut. The cashier lunged for the handle, but I managed to lock it just in time. He banged on the window, shouting something I couldn't make out, and I threw the car into reverse, slamming on the gas. The car that had been blocking me skidded backward as I shoved it with my bumper, creating just enough space for me to squeeze out. I sped down the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I pulled into a well-lit diner and sat in my car, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. The image of the cashier's blank stare and the rusty knife was burned into my mind. I reported the incident to the local police, but I never heard back. To this day, I don't know what was going on at that gas station or what work they had in mind for me. All I know is that I'll never stop at an isolated gas station again, especially not at night. About a year ago, I was living alone in a small apartment in a quiet part of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was close to work, and the neighborhood felt safe enough. At least, that's what I thought. One evening, I stopped by the grocery store after work to pick up a few things for dinner. It was a small, locally owned place, the kind where the employees know most of the customers by name. I liked the vibe, friendly, familiar. That night, it wasn't too busy, just a handful of people browsing the aisles. As I wandered through the produce section, I noticed a man standing by the potatoes. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, and dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as I moved on to other sections of the store, I realized he was following me. Every aisle I went down, he was there, pretending to browse, but always glancing in my direction. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but my gut was telling me otherwise. I made a point to zigzag through the store, deliberately backtracking and switching aisles. No matter where I went, he was never far behind. By the time I reached the checkout counter, my nerves were shot. The cashier, a middle-aged woman named Linda, could tell I was uneasy. "Everything okay, hun?" she asked as she scanned my items. I hesitated, not wanting to make a scene. "Yeah, just tired," I said, forcing a smile. The man had stopped near the entrance, pretending to look at a magazine rack. I could feel his eyes on me as I bagged my groceries. When I left the store, I deliberately took my time walking to my car, hoping he'd lose interest and stay inside. But when I glanced over my shoulder, he was following me out. My heart raced as I reached my car. I quickly unlocked it, threw my bags in the passenger seat, and got in, locking the doors behind me. The man lingered in the parking lot, standing a few cars away, staring at me. I started the engine and drove off, watching him in my rearview mirror until he disappeared from view. I tried to shake it off as I headed home, but the unease lingered. Something about his behavior didn't sit right. I checked my rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see his car behind me, but the drive home was uneventful. When I got to my apartment, I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, something I rarely did before. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow. The next day, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a harmless weirdo and I'd blown the whole thing out of proportion. But a week later, I saw him again. It was late in the evening, and I was coming home from work. As I parked in my usual spot, I noticed a car idling across the street. The headlights were off, but I could see someone sitting inside. I didn't recognize the car, but when I stepped out, I caught a glimpse of the driver. It was him. My stomach dropped. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and peeking through the blinds. The car stayed there for another 10 minutes before slowly driving off. Over the next few weeks, I saw him several more times. Sometimes he'd be parked outside my apartment. Other times I'd spot him on the street when I went for a walk or ran errands. He never approached me, but the fact that he was always around made my skin crawl. One night, things escalated. I was in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a noise outside my window. It was faint, like someone tapping on the glass. My heart was pounding as I crept over to the window and peeked through the blinds. He was standing there. He was so close I could see the fog of his breath on the glass. His face was partially obscured by the hoodie, but I recognized him instantly. I stumbled backward, grabbing my phone and dialing 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anything. I showed them the footage from my doorbell camera, which captured him lingering outside my apartment earlier that night. They took a report and promised to patrol the neighborhood more frequently, but there wasn't much else they could do. That was the last time I saw him. Whether the police scared him off or he decided I wasn't worth the trouble, I don't know. But for months afterward, I lived in constant fear, jumping at every sound and shadow. I eventually moved to a new apartment in a different part of town, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. Even now, I can't go grocery shopping without scanning the aisles, looking for him or someone like him. The thought of being watched, followed, haunted, it's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Some people say, trust your gut. I say, trust your fear. It might just save your life. About a year ago, I moved into a small rental house on a quiet suburban street. It was affordable and the neighborhood seemed safe. Most of the houses were occupied by families or older couples, and the few neighbors I met were friendly enough. But there was one house at the very end of the street that always gave me an uneasy feeling. The house was old and run down, with peeling paint and a lawn that was overgrown and littered with junk. I rarely saw anyone coming or going, but every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of a man in the yard, middle-aged, scruffy, always wearing the same faded flannel shirt and jeans. He'd be out there in the early mornings, sitting on an old lawn chair, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the street. The first time I waved at him, he didn't respond. He just stared at me with this blank, almost lifeless expression. After that, I avoided eye contact whenever I walked past his house. One rainy evening, I was sitting in my living room scrolling through my phone when I heard a knock at the door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anyone, and I didn't really know my neighbors well enough for them to stop by unannounced. The knock came again, louder this time. I got up and peeked through the peephole. Standing on my porch, drenched from the rain, was the man from the end of the street. My heart started to race. I hesitated, not sure whether to open the door or pretend I wasn't home. Before I could decide, he knocked again and said, "I need to talk to you." His voice was rough, almost gravelly, and it sent a chill down my spine. Against my better judgment, I cracked the door open just enough to talk to him. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, water dripping from his clothes, his eyes fixed on me. Finally, he said, "You need to be careful. There's been someone around." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Someone's been watching this street," he said. glancing over his shoulder. Late at night, thought you should know. The way he said it made me uneasy, like he wasn't just warning me. He was testing me, gauging my reaction. I nodded quickly and said, "Thanks for letting me know," before closing the door. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why had he come to my house specifically? And what did he mean by, "Someone's been watching"? A few nights later, I found out. It was around 2 a.m., and I was lying in bed, struggling to fall asleep. The rain had picked up again, pounding against the windows. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a noise outside, a faint scraping sound like something being dragged along the sidewalk. I got up and looked out the window. At first, I didn't see anything, but then in the glow of the streetlight, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was hard to make out any details in the rain, but whoever it was, they weren't moving. They were just standing there, staring at my house. My first thought was that it was the man from the end of the street, but something about the figure was different. They were taller, broader, and their posture was rigid, almost unnatural. I watched them for what felt like an eternity, hoping they'd leave, but they didn't. They just stood there, motionless. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check it out. While I waited, I kept my eyes on the figure, but just as the police car pulled onto the street, they disappeared into the shadows. The officers searched the area but didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably just a prank or a neighbor out for a walk, but their reassurances didn't do much to calm my nerves. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on my front porch. They led up to my door and then back down the steps, disappearing into the wet grass. My stomach turned as I realized whoever had been standing in the road hadn't just been watching. They'd come up to my house. I didn't see the man from the end of the street for several days after that. His lawn chair was empty, and his house looked even more abandoned than usual. I started to wonder if he'd had something to do with the figure in the road, or if he'd been a victim himself. Then one night I heard a commotion outside, yelling, the sound of breaking glass and the screech of tires. I looked out the window and saw police cars swarming the man's house at the end of the street. Officers were dragging him out in handcuffs while others searched the property. The next day, the news broke. The man had been under investigation for months. He'd been breaking into homes in the area, stealing valuables, and, most chillingly, installing hidden cameras to spy on his neighbors. The figure I'd seen in the road? They'd found evidence in his house suggesting he'd been watching me for weeks. I moved out of that house shortly after. To this day, I can't sit in my living room at night without closing all the blinds and double-checking the locks. Sometimes I wonder if he'd been trying to warn me that night on my porch, or if he'd been testing how easy of a target I was. This happened a few years ago when I was working late shifts at a downtown office. I usually didn't mind staying late. Most of my coworkers left by 6, and the quiet atmosphere helped me focus. The only downside was the parking garage. It was one of those dimly lit, multi-level structures that always felt a little too empty, even during the day. By the time I left work at night, it was usually completely deserted. One particular night, I wrapped up work around 11 p.m. and made my way to the garage. My car was parked on the 3rd level, near the far corner where the lighting was especially bad. I don't know why I always parked there. Habit, I guess. But that night, I regretted it. As I walked through the garage, the sound of my heels clicking against the concrete echoed eerily. I kept telling myself it was fine. I'd done this 100 times before. But that night, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and every shadow felt like it was watching me. When I reached my car, I unlocked it and climbed in. quickly locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, my headlights illuminated the area in front of me, and that's when I saw her. A woman was standing about 20 feet away, just beyond the range of the headlights. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. She was wearing a long coat, and her hair was wet, like she'd just come in from the rain. I hadn't seen her when I walked to my car, and the suddenness of her appearance made my stomach drop. I rolled down the window just a crack and called out, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to figure me out. Her face was partially shadowed, but there was something unsettling about the way she stood there, so still, so quiet. I rolled the window back up and put the car into reverse, trying to stay calm. As I backed out of the space, the woman took a step forward, then another. She wasn't walking toward me exactly, more like circling, keeping just out of the headlights' full reach. My hands were shaking as I shifted into drive and started toward the exit. The parking garage's layout forced me to loop around the level to reach the ramp. As I drove, I kept glancing in my mirrors, but I didn't see her anymore. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd overreacted, that she was just someone waiting for a ride or looking for her own car. But when I reached the ramp to the second level, she was there. She stepped out of the shadows and stood directly in front of the exit, forcing me to stop. My headlights fully illuminated her this time, and I could see her face clearly. She was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, like she was trying to mimic an expression she didn't understand. I honked the horn, hoping she'd move, but she just stood there, her eyes locked on mine. Panic was starting to take over. I didn't want to get out of the car, but I couldn't stay there either. Then, without warning, she stepped to the side, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where she went. I floored the gas and sped out of the garage, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows and spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just a weirdo, someone who liked messing with people. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I mentioned the incident to the security guard at my office building. His face went pale, and he immediately pulled up the garage's security footage. What we saw sent chills down my spine. The footage showed me walking to my car, just as I remembered. But as I unlocked the door, the woman stepped out from behind a nearby column. She'd been hiding there the entire time, watching me. She didn't follow me right away. She just stood there, waiting until I was inside the car. Then, as I started to back out, she began moving, deliberately staying just outside the headlights' reach. The guard told me I wasn't the first person to report a strange encounter in the garage. A few weeks earlier, another woman had called the police after being approached by someone matching the same description. That woman had been on foot, and the encounter had ended with the stranger chasing her through the garage before she managed to escape. I never saw the woman again, but I stopped parking in that garage after dark. To this day, I can't go into a parking structure without feeling a sense of dread. The thought of someone watching, waiting, and knowing they could appear at any moment is something I'll never shake.